Good morning, this is Dr. Long at Delro. I want to walk you through a mind map integration of the military cognitive processing that I see going on in my own head, in the minds of staffs that are doing collaborative planning, and in the mind of a commander who's trying to develop his own estimate of the situation in order to give good guidance and directives to the staff and subordinates. So this is a combination of individual cognitive effort and organizational planning and design thinking. So this is a set of processes and relationships that I've just sort of noticed over time, and I felt like I wanted to put it into an organized view in order to see what I might see, to look at boundaries and phases as a way to begin the discussion of what it means to be thinking and planning in a professional way. So across the top in section 1, I want you to notice these headers. This first section in the 10 I labeled pre-mission analysis context and the setting. And this is what I believe is our walking around knowledge. Combines not just formal history, but the history of what's been going on and what we remember about it. You could almost think of that as memory as well, but it might be more organized history. The UJITL is the Uniform Joint Task List, which is the distilled doctrinal task descriptions of units at every echelon and what they must do based on warfighting function. Like Task 1 is the personnel, Task 2 and the whole family of Task 2, 2.1 and 2.2 has to do with intel, Task 3 is operations, Task 4 logistics, and so on. So it's a distilled summary of required capabilities for units and therefore for staff to be able to support those units. It's a subset of doctrine, so maybe a higher level application of doctrine. Doctrine itself, authoritative guidance that we vary from at our peril or based on sound professional reasons. Then tactics, techniques, and procedures, standing operating procedures and lessons learned, which come from our experience plus reflection and being vetted and tested and tried and reasonable, but not yet rising to the level of doctrine. Maybe it only has a local application or from our refined experience. So there's at least these different hierarchies of organized professional thinking that's based on professional reflections about our experience. So that whole walking around knowledge I think of as your most current running estimate of what's going on. So if this top section is going to talk about collaborative and individual processing, at the bottom I think of this as internal mental states and cognitive processing, similar to the Chris Argyris ladder of inference. And it answers the question of where does the continuous running estimate come from? If the running estimate is the end product, I see three big phases happening where we start with our current set of beliefs, which we hold for certain reasons, maybe conscious, semi-conscious, or unconscious, but we have those operating beliefs. And then we make observations about the world through our senses, and then we form impressions, probably from our intuitions or our spider sense or our feelings or the proposals. Maybe they're not even put in words yet, but beginning to form mental pictures of what's going on. And then we shift to a second stage of more formal thinking where we analyze those beliefs, observations, impressions, and maybe categorize them by facts, assumptions, and then use reasoning to make conclusions about those facts and assumptions. So we're already updating this first set of beliefs, observations, and impressions. And from those tentative conclusions, I would say that probably is also your current running estimate. So in the same way that your top-level impressions and then maybe your more formal analytical conclusions after you've done some work, and then maybe that causes you to form hypotheses in order to test them so that you can investigate them in a certain way, either practically or research or a combination, and maybe you're looking for certain criteria about how to make decisions based on what you find, and then the results come back and then you judge that against criteria to determine if you rise to the level of decision readiness. Like, have my criteria been met? Can I actually launch people in an operation? So the results of that investigation or research comes back and allows you to continue to update your running estimates. So if individuals might do that and go through 3 formal phases, each one of those is a decision to raise to the next level of intensity or effortful action. And staffs can do that as well inside warfighting functions, like the logistics staff in the G4 shop might do all of those things and form some kind of G4 sustainment running estimate. And maybe that's what the commander does when he integrates the running estimates of all his staff and with his subordinates too. So I think this models broad phases and types of thinking and conclusion making about the world. And then it's related to what we're doing as we go through these more formal processes of Army formal planning. So I think of the pre-mission analysis context and setting as being something like a summary of wherever we are in the mental state. And I think you should know where you are and what you're doing, what happens next, and make decisions on when to move to that next higher level of effort. And then at some point, we, at this boundary, receive a mission, which gives us time, place, purpose, and state from 2 levels higher, 1 level higher. Maybe it starts as a warning order, and we start going through a top-down analytical process to think about the mission we've received and the end state we're trying to achieve based on directives from higher, for which we've received resources, units, etc. And we might further break that down into specified and then implied tasks that we have to do in order to achieve that end state, no matter what specific course of action or sequence of activities we're going to engage in. Those specified and implied tasks become the things we have to do. Maybe that rises to the level of a mission essential task at the end of this stuff. Constraints and limitations, and even delimitations that limit what it is that we can do, or what holds us down, or boundaries you can't cross, and those might be by choice or by laws of nature or by directive. And we can start thinking about threats and opportunities that we already can see and feel and anticipate to start informing our risk and reward estimates. And if that's the top-down analytical process, that's almost like this step here where we're doing facts, assumptions, and conclusions, doing some initial processing. And then a bottoms-up intel preparation of the battlefield. So we think of see the terrain, see the enemy, see yourself. We might do that as the intelligence staff director, but also warfighting functions do that in their area of expertise to see how the terrain affects friendly and enemy, and then what are the enemy's capabilities so we can help the S2, the intel officer, assemble an integrated notes summary from all the warfighting functions in order to present an integrated, synthesized, top-level, sense-making narrative about the situation as we see it collectively as a staff. And the commander probably is also doing that with his little individual commander's estimate based on his experience, wisdom, insights, and sensing sources of information. And then from that, we might collectively come to a statement of the problem, which says, what is the problem we're trying to solve here, that takes into account all of this stuff from the left and informed by the processes on the bottom. Then we might already know what it is to do. If that problem statement is well structured, we might just engage troop leading procedures and do what we know needs to be done without any further ado. And some things might require formal planning where we have a pretty good idea and a couple real choices, but it's semi-structured, and so we can immediately go right to military decision-making planning, and maybe the commander gives us his quick estimate based on his running estimate and gives us the guidance we need to develop the plan. But if it's a ill-structured problem or a wicked problem and it's not clear what we specifically need to do, we might need to engage in design thinking and do more of this before we get to the formal planning. And we might need to give the commander the benefit of our creative and critical thinking so that he can update his running estimate and then give us the definitive action-oriented guidance that will launch this rational utility model, which is the MDMP. And so the current state is where we are. Maybe that's see the terrain, see the enemy, see self, plus status reports and all the details from the science of control and the art of command. and then that future state describes an elaboration of what the end state that we receive from higher, but maybe a more detailed vision of what right looks like. And then the problem frame might be those things that conspire to keep us from just going. Well, why don't you just go from the current state to the future state? Oh, because of problems, and maybe we try to solve that, but it's more difficult than it seems. And so we might have to then formulate an operational approach that allows us to get around, through, over, or reduce that problem frame in order to achieve the future state. And we keep going in an iterative way in this design thinking until it seems like we have a reasonably robust and feasible operational approach that allows us to manage or bypass or solve this or account for this problem frame based on what we know from external manifestations as well as the what we can detect as the root cause or estimate of the root cause. When we have an operational approach that seems like it would fit inside our environmental frame, then we can say that we've completed the problem frame as well, and now we have a way that we can go from current state to future state, and we can tell the boss about that, our estimate of the situation, and then he can use that to inform his decision and guidance that describes his vision for the operation, the end state that he wants us to achieve, the purpose of why we're doing things, any initial planning guidance that will be incorporated into our military decision-making process. Maybe he gives us some specific course of action development guidance. I want to see a course of action that features this and one that features that, and make sure that you emphasize this but don't do that, and so that COA guidance might become additional, like constraints, limitations, or delimitations, or points of emphasis. And he might have already formulated the criteria that he wants us to use to evaluate these developed courses of action that we will develop as in MTMP. And we've probably identified commander's critical information requirements so that we know what it is in that whole fog of war and uncertainty that's out there that we need to specifically go search and find and answer so that we can get the big pieces right. So collectively we'll call those CCIR. And then from that we might have distilled a sense of the commander's risks that he's willing to take in order to achieve what kinds of rewards, and maybe those are tiered or echeloned or layered. And so out of all of that, we have guidance from the commander that allows us then to engage in military decision-making in a reasonable, process-oriented way under the Chief of Staff. That frees the commander to leave the command post and go out and walk the line, talk to a subordinate commander, see what he may see through his own eyes and ears and spider sense, so that when he comes back and gets the benefit of the staff work, he has some independent estimates by which he may evaluate what it is that we propose to tell him, because we're going to base our recommendations on our own individual and warfighting functional estimates, and we are constrained by the sources of data and our processing and our background. So we give him the staff's eye view of the world, and he balances that against the commander's eye view of the world, plus what he gets from his subordinate commanders. And then from that triangulation, he can make judgment about what we propose the mission should be and the course of action to recommend and all that. Well, way over on the right-hand side, you see this integration. This corresponds to a couple different things. The departments in the college that have refined bodies of knowledge from each of these perspectives that informs the everything that we're doing over here with our professional judgment, but from a particular lens. And so we have the ability to look at this complex battlefield and our inner mental space through these different lenses to ensure that we're considering things from a critical and creative point of view or set of points of view, all of which we also use to update and shape our internal processing through those lenses. So each of these are perspectives, points of view, processes, principles, considerations, lessons learned, and all that stuff. Well, if you think of this as the upper deck that's overwatching this from a strategic level maybe, or a critical thinking distance to make sure that we're not getting lost in the weeds or becoming lockstep through a linear process if we're not careful, that gives us the ability to look at this holistically and in an integrated way. We might have learned things along the way that we can always start putting into these bins in the same way that things that we're learning during these different stages in the process we might use to start filling up these bins. And so at any given time, I would argue that you ought to know what it is that you've got in all your bins, and when does it rise to the level of action, and how often do you go back and refine that. So if you think of a football coach with his little play calling support graphic, this might be a way for us to think in a systematic way about where we are and what we're doing and how it relies on what went before and how long that information was of value and what we are needing to see going forward, and how we use this in order to shape plans to issue orders with enough confidence in what we're doing to be willing to risk lives and the nation's goals on what we decide to do. That's the consequences of our professional judgment. So that's a matter for serious people, and we ought to know how we think and what the order is. And this is my effort, simply to describe in a systematic way what I see in my own head, what I remember from how we did it back in the day, and what I see in the classroom, and watching other trusted agents go through their steps, and what I try to learn from the different departments as I see how they look at the world to shape the way I look at the world, so that I can be a better person and a better planner. So I offer this as a beginning of a project that will help us, I hope, and help me for sure, organize my thinking to account for why I believe the things I do and why I'm ready to act in a certain circumstance and what it was that I took into account. And have I really visited all of these areas as I make this rush to judgment for my continuous running estimate? Because the tyranny of time and your priorities and your spider sense all along the way, this art of command and this intuitive sense making that is informed by professional judgment, but which we trust with our gut, becomes an important element of how we decide what it is we're going to do. So you ought to consider, what are the environmental factors that are going on at the time that cause you to make decisions based on how you feel about it and the integration that you've made. And you've got to watch your commander when you're the XO or you're a staff officer to see where he is and how he's doing. When does he need rest, and when is he on it, and when is he acting differently? Have we taken any shortcuts, or where can we streamline our process given the time? So this is a way to start thinking in an organized way, I hope, about this combination of art and science that reflects command and control and mission command and just how we do our job. So thank you so much for your kind attention, and I'd be interested in your thoughts and reactions and additions and subtractions to this as we go. So thanks a lot, and we'll see you in the classroom.